The blood on her hands had already dried by the time she understood what it meant. Ella stood at the edge of the stone corridor, her fingers pressed flat against the cold wall, the rough granite biting into her palms. The candle she carried had burned down to its last inch. Around her, the great hall of the Ashvale estate was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from everyone having already gone to sleep with secrets tucked beneath their pillows. She had not been able to sleep. It had started 3 hours earlier, when the cramps woke her. They were not unusual. The Omega sickness, the healer called it, that particular weakness of her body that the pack had always regarded as something between misfortune and inconvenience. Her Omega nature had never presented itself with the grace the elders expected. No warmth, no pleasing scent, no docile softness. Only a fragile immune system, a sensitivity to cold that left her shivering through autumn, and a pair of pale gray eyes that people found unsettling when she held their gaze too long. She had risen from bed to fetch the tincture the healer left her on the kitchen shelf. Lavender and white willow bark, steeped in iron water. It smelled like wet earth and almost nothing else, and it worked just well enough to let her function. She had not intended to hear anything. The kitchen door was ajar. The voices beyond it were low, her stepmother's, cool and precise as a blade laid flat on a table. And beside it, a man's voice she recognized with a jolt that stopped her feet entirely. Edmund, her husband of 4 months. 4 months. She had not yet learned to think of him as hers. He had smiled through the bonding ceremony, with the ease of a man performing a task he had rehearsed, and she had told herself it was nerves. Told herself it was the weight of the occasion. Told herself the way he touched her hand felt clinical, because he was simply private, simply reserved. She pressed herself against the wall outside the kitchen door and listened. The transfer must be completed before the first snow, her stepmother said. Once the Ashvale deed passes to her name by default inheritance law, it becomes considerably harder. I understand the timeline, Edmund said, but the council will question a death so soon after bonding. Ella's chest turned to stone. Not if it appears to be a progression of her existing condition. Her stepmother's voice was so steady it was almost beautiful, the way ice over a river is beautiful, smooth, serene, entirely capable of breaking under the weight of something living. The healer has already adjusted the tincture, a slow weakening, nothing sudden. The pack will grieve an Omega too frail to survive. It is not without precedent. A pause. The sound of Edmund setting down a cup. And the boy? He asked. Her brother has been dealt with separately. He is no longer in the territory. Ella's hand found her mouth before the sound could escape. Her brother, Cale, 22 years old, quieter than she was, kinder than she deserved. The only person in that estate who had ever looked at her like she was worth something more than the land beneath her feet. Dealt with. The words landed in her body like something physical, a blow she had not braced for. She did not wait to hear more. The tincture, she understood now, had been changed. She thought of the strange bitterness at the bottom of last night's cup, the headache that followed, the unusual heaviness in her limbs that she had blamed on the cold season. The healer she had trusted, whose dried herbs hung in bundles from the kitchen beams, had already begun. She turned and walked, not ran, back through the corridor. Running would make noise. Running meant panic. Ella had learned very young that survival sometimes required the appearance of composure, even when everything underneath was tearing apart. She reached her room, closed the door without a sound, and stood in the center of it with the dead candle in her hand. Think. The Ashvale estate would pass to her at the first snowfall of her 24th year, by the terms of her father's will. She had 3 weeks, perhaps less, if the poison in the tincture was already accumulating. Her stepmother had spent 4 years managing the estate on her behalf, and Ella had been grateful, had been blind, had mistaken administration for affection and proximity for loyalty. She had no pack. The Ashvale pack had dissolved when her father died, the wolves scattering to other territories. She had no allies in the town. Edmund had arrived through her stepmother's arrangement, a third son from a minor family, handsome enough that Ella had allowed herself a cautious warmth toward the idea of him. She had thought, she had allowed herself to think. It did not matter what she had thought. She moved to the wardrobe. She pulled out the winter riding cloak, the dark wool one, and the pair of boots she used for early morning walks when the ground was still hard. She dressed in layers, her hands steady from sheer necessity. She reached under the mattress and drew out the small leather pouch she had kept there since childhood. Old coins, a folded note in her father's handwriting that she could not bring herself to read yet, and a ring with the Ashvale seal, which she pressed into her palm and held until her heartbeat slowed. Through the window, the forest at the edge of the estate was a dark mass against a slightly lighter sky. No moon tonight. The kind of dark that felt complete. She thought of Cale, dealt with separately, no longer in the territory. She did not know if that meant imprisoned, exiled, or something she refused to name. But he was the reason she could not simply run east to the nearest settlement and ask for shelter. He was the reason she had to find someone with enough power to push back against whatever her stepmother had built. She had heard rumors, the way everyone in the outlying territories heard rumors, carried in by traders and passing guards and the occasional messenger who stopped at the inn. There was an AlphaKing 3 territories to the north, Dominic of the Dawn Ridge Court. Ruthless, they said, in the way powerful men are always described as ruthless by people who fear them. Fair, others said, more quietly. He had dissolved 2 corrupt councils in the past year. He had returned land to families whose claims had been buried by false documentation. Ella did not know if any of that was true. She only knew that north was the direction farthest from Edmund's family lands, and that a man with the power to dissolve councils might be the only kind of man her stepmother could not simply arrange around. She pushed open the window. Cold air hit her face immediately, sharp and clean, and smelling of pine resin and the first suggestion of frost on the grass below. She lowered herself over the sill, dropped the last short distance to the frozen ground, and did not look back at the room behind her. The night was very dark and very cold, and entirely indifferent to what she needed. She walked into it anyway. The forest received her without ceremony. Branches overhead, the occasional snap of something small moving away from her footsteps, the distant sound of the wind working through the upper canopy. She pulled the cloak tight and moved north, navigating by the thin break in the trees where the road cut through, staying just off the path itself in case someone came after her quickly. She did not let herself think about Edmund's voice, the calm in it, the complete absence of regret. She did not let herself think about the tincture she had almost drunk again tonight. She thought instead about Cale, the way he used to fall asleep at the library table with his head on his arms, and she would drape his coat over his shoulders without waking him, the way he argued with her about everything, and never once made her feel small for disagreeing back. She thought about the Ashvale seal pressing into her palm. She walked north, and the cold swallowed the sound of her footsteps, and somewhere behind her the estate sat dark and quiet, and no one yet knew she was gone. She walked for 2 hours before her legs began to fail her. It was not weakness of will. Ella understood the difference between her mind giving up and her body presenting a bill she had not expected. The accumulated effect of whatever had been added to the tincture over the past weeks was making itself known now that the fear-driven adrenaline was thinning. Her knees felt wrong. There was a tremor in her left hand that she could not stop by pressing her fingers together. The cold was not helping. It settled into her bones with a particular cruelty, the way cold always had, the omega sensitivity to temperature that she had spent years managing through layering and caution, and the bitter tincture that was no longer safe. She stopped at the base of a large pine and pressed her back against it. The forest was still. No sound of pursuit. Not yet. She had perhaps until dawn before anyone noticed her absence, and dawn was still hours away. She needed to cover more ground before then. She needed to reach the northern road, which connected Asheville territory to the outer districts, where she might find a traveling party willing to take on a passenger. She pushed herself upright and kept moving. The tremor spread to her right hand by the time the trees began to thin. Through the gaps, she could make out the pale suggestion of a road, the packed earth of the northern trade route, wider than the forest paths, and better maintained. She stepped out from the tree line carefully, looked both directions along the empty road, and chose north. For a while, the walking steadied her. The rhythm of it, the simple mechanical requirement of placing one foot in front of the other, gave her mind something to organize around. She thought about what she knew of the Dawnridge Court. Her father had mentioned it twice when she was young, once as an example of a well-governed territory, once in the context of a trade agreement that had fallen through. He had spoken of the AlphaKing with respect, which from her father had meant something. He had not been generous with his respect. She thought about what she would say if she reached him. She had no proof of anything yet. A conversation heard through a door, a tincture she had not drunk, a brother missing from a territory. None of it was the kind of evidence that compelled a king to action. She would need to think carefully, speak carefully, not show how frightened she was, not give him any reason to dismiss her as a confused Omega, making accusations against her own husband and stepmother without grounds. The road curved ahead, following the line of the hillside. Around that curve, she heard horses. She moved off the road immediately, back into the shadow of the tree line, and waited. 2 riders, moving at a steady pace, carrying no lantern, which meant either they knew the road well enough to navigate by moonlight, or they were deliberately traveling without light. Both possibilities made her still. They passed. She waited, counted to 50, then stepped back onto the road. She had miscounted something. She realized it a half second before the 3rd rider came around the curve, slower than the others, separate, perhaps a scout. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. For a breath, neither of them moved. Then he called out, and his voice carried the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You, hold." She did not hold. She turned back toward the trees. She did not make it. He was faster, not rushing, not aggressive, just efficiently repositioning his horse to cut off her angle, and she pulled up short rather than run directly into the animal's path. The horse was large, dark, and calm. Its rider looked down at her with an expression she could not fully read in the darkness. "Traveling alone," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said, because denying the obvious would only make her seem more suspicious. "On the northern road, before dawn, in a riding cloak with no horse." He seemed to be cataloging facts rather than accusing her. "Are you running from something, or toward something?" "That is not your concern." A pause. He leaned forward slightly in the saddle, not threateningly, just looking at her more carefully. She could make out the outline of him now. Tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, the kind of physical presence that occupied space without effort. He wore a dark riding coat, no visible house colors, but the quality of the horse and the gear was not that of a common patrol. "You're shaking," he said. "I'm cold." "You're also pale, even by this light." He swung down from the horse with an ease that suggested he had done it 10,000 times. He was taller standing than she had estimated. He took one step toward her, and stopped when she stepped back. "I'm not going to touch you. I want to see your face. You can see my face from there. I can see part of it." He tilted his head slightly. "You've been poisoned." The word hit her like cold water. She had not said anything. She had not indicated anything. She had kept her voice level and her posture as controlled as she could manage. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "You're sent." He said it simply, without drama. There's something underneath it that doesn't belong. A compound. I've encountered it before. It's used slowly, so the degradation looks natural. He watched her face. You didn't know what it was, but you knew something was wrong. That's why you ran. She looked at him for a long moment. The tremor in her hands had not stopped. The cold was working into her chest now. That particular tightness she associated with the worst winter days. And she recognized with a clarity that was almost calm that she was in considerably worse physical condition than she had wanted to admit to herself. "Who are you?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. He turned his head toward the direction his two riders had gone, and she heard, faintly, the sound of them returning. They had noticed his absence and doubled back. "Someone who is not going to leave you on this road," he said. "That's what matters at the moment." "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her again, and there was something in his attention that was different from the way most people looked at her. Not assessing her weakness, not cataloging what she lacked, simply looking, the way one looks at something that requires accurate understanding before action. "Can you walk another quarter-mile?" "I've been walking for 2 hours. A quarter-mile is not the problem." "Then walk with me." He gestured along the road, north. "There's a way station past the next hill rise. Fire, water, shelter. We can talk there." "I don't know you." "You don't," he said. "But you're also out of options that don't involve collapsing in the road before sunrise, and I think you're intelligent enough to know that." He said it without condescension, stating a fact, the way one states weather. "I'll stay 3 steps ahead of you the entire way if it helps." She hated that he was right. She hated more that she could feel her body voting for the warmth before her mind had finished deliberating. 3 steps, she said. 3 steps, he confirmed, and turned, and walked. She followed, watching the width of his shoulders against the dark sky, watching the way he moved. No hurry, no performance. Just the steady pace of someone who had decided on a direction and saw no reason to deviate from it. His 2 riders fell in at a distance behind them, far enough back that she didn't feel bracketed. The way station was exactly where he said it would be. A low stone structure, well maintained, with a fire already laid in the pit, and wood stacked neatly against the wall. Someone had been here recently. The ash was still warm. He built the fire up without asking her to help and without making a show of it, and she sat on the low bench near it and let the heat begin working on the cold in her chest. He sat across from her and said nothing for a moment. In the firelight, she could see him properly for the first time. Dark hair, cut short. A jaw that suggested he had not shaved in 2 or 3 days. Eyes so dark they were nearly black. Steady and unhurried in a way that was either very controlled or very certain, and she could not yet tell which. There was a scar along his left jaw, thin and old, running from the ear toward the chin. He looked at her with the same quality of attention he'd shown on the road, calibrated, direct, devoid of the particular brand of dismissiveness that most male wolves offered Omegas when there was no social benefit to being kind. "Your name," he said. "Ella." She saw no reason to withhold it. "Ella Ashvile." Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible, but she had learned to read small things in people's faces, and she noted it. "Ashvale," he repeated. "You recognize it." "I recognize the territory." He paused. "My name is Dominic." The fire crackled. Ella sat very still. She had been walking toward him for 2 hours without knowing it. He watched her process this, and did not rush her. Did not explain, or justify, or offer reassurances. He simply waited, with the patience of someone who understood that the next thing she decided mattered more than anything he could say to influence it. She thought about the way station, the fire laid in advance, the 2 riders who had not crowded her. She thought about the fact that he had identified the poison in her blood before she had named it, and had still chosen to ask, rather than act. She thought about Edmund's voice, smooth and empty, and the way this man had said you've been poisoned. Not as an accusation, not as a demonstration of cleverness, but as though it were simply something she deserved to know. My stepmother wants my estate, she said. My husband is part of it. They've been slowly poisoning me through the healer's tincture. And my brother has disappeared from the territory. She said it all at once, flat and precise, watching his face. I have no proof yet. Only what I heard and what my body is telling me. I need someone with enough authority that she cannot arrange around them, and I need to find Kale before she does something permanent. He held her gaze through all of it. How long? He said. Do you think the compound has been in the tincture? Weeks, perhaps 6. He nodded slowly. Then you need a proper healer before anything else. One of mine, tonight. And after that? After that, he said, we talk about your brother. The healer was a woman named Sorcha, compact and gray-haired and completely unimpressed by anyone in the room, including the AlphaKing. She arrived at the way station within the hour, which told Ella that Dominic's camp was closer than he had let on, perhaps half a mile into the forest, tucked off the northern road in the way that military encampments are tucked, visible only to people who already know where to look. Sorcha examined Ella with brisk efficiency, pressing 2 fingers against the inside of her wrist, lifting her eyelids to check the whites, smelling the inside of her elbow in a manner so matter-of-fact that Ella did not have time to find it strange. Ashenweed derivative, Sorcha said, not to Ella, but to the room in general. Mixed with something to mask the taste. Bitterness would have seemed like the willow bark. Clever. She said the last word with the flat contempt of someone who finds cleverness used for harm to be a particular waste. 6 weeks at this dosage would explain the tremors, the temperature sensitivity, the fatigue. She would have presented as a natural decline within 2 months. Ella sat on the bench and listened to her own body being described, and felt something cold and clear settle over her, the kind of clarity that comes after the shock has passed, and only the facts remain. Can it be reversed? Dominic asked. He was standing near the door, arms crossed, watching Sorcha work. Mostly. The compound doesn't bind permanently at this stage. She'll need a purging draft tonight, red clover and ironbark base, and then a strict regimen for the next 10 days. Sorcha looked at Ella directly for the first time with something approaching warmth. You'll feel considerably worse before you feel better. The purge is unpleasant, but you'll stop shaking by morning. I'll manage, Ella said. Sorcha studied her for a moment. Yes, she said, as though confirming something she had already suspected. I imagine you will. The draft was exactly as unpleasant as promised. Ella spent the better part of an hour in the back room of the way station, while her body argued violently with the medicine, and when it was over, she was wrung out and hollow and calmer than she had felt since waking to the sound of voices through a kitchen door. The tremor in her hands had already begun to ease. She washed her face in the cold water basin and looked at herself in the small clouded mirror above it. Pale, yes, shadows beneath her eyes, the particular gauntness of someone who has been slowly depleted. But her eyes were steady. That, she thought, was enough for tonight. When she came back to the main room, Dominic was alone. Sorcha had gone, and the 2 riders were outside. The fire had been built up properly, and someone had left a cup of plain hot water and a small piece of hard bread on the bench beside her previous seat. She sat and wrapped her hands around the cup. You knew the territory name, she said. Before I told you anything. What do you know about Ashvale? He sat across from her. The firelight moved across the scar along his jaw. Your father submitted a petition to the court 7 years ago. A border dispute with the neighboring estate, the Verne family. The petition was handled by my predecessor's counsel and buried without review. Your father died the following winter. Ella was quiet for a moment. He never told me he'd petitioned the court. He may not have wanted to explain why it failed. Dominic's voice was even. I reviewed the petition records 18 months ago as part of a broader audit. The Ashvale file was flagged. The burial wasn't clerical error. Someone paid to have it removed from consideration. The Verne family. Possibly. Possibly someone who stood to benefit from Ashvale remaining in legal uncertainty. He paused. I had a writer dispatched to your territory 6 months ago to make preliminary inquiries. He reported that the estate was being administered by your stepmother, that you had recently bonded, and that there was no obvious irregularity. A brief pause. He did not speak with you directly. No one speaks with me directly, Ella said, without bitterness. Just fact. I am an Omega with no pack, no wolves in my household, and a stepmother who has had 4 years to build the impression she wanted. She looked down at the cup in her hands. What happens to the estate if I die without issue before the inheritance transfers? It would revert to the closest managing party with an established claim, which in practice means her, and through her, Edmund's family. She set the cup down. She married me to him, so the claim would have a male name attached when the time came, and then she intended to remove me before the transfer completed. She said it plainly because saying it plainly was the only way to keep hold of it without it pulling her under. My brother Cale would have contested it. He has standing as a blood relation, so he was removed first. Yes, Dominic said. That would be the logical sequence. Do you know where he is? Not yet, but I have people who can find out. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the directness she was beginning to recognize as simply how he communicated. No softening, no performance, no particular effort to manage her feelings around the facts. I want to be clear about something. I can pursue this because it falls under my jurisdiction. The fraudulent burial of your father's petition, the administration of a territory under my oversight, the use of poison, the illegal removal of a blood heir. These are not small matters. I have grounds to act regardless of your situation personally. I understand, she said. But I want your involvement. Not as a claimant I'm representing, as someone who knows this better than I do. He watched her face. You heard the conversation. You know the players. You know how your stepmother thinks. That knowledge is more useful to me than any document. Ella looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and the fire shifted. She thought about what it meant to be useful to a king. How easily that could become another form of being used. How readily powerful men mistook cooperation for ownership. You said you have grounds to act regardless of my situation personally, she said. What does that mean for me? If you resolve this through your court and your authority, what becomes of my role in it? Do I appear as a witness and then return to whatever arrangement you determine for the estate? He did not answer immediately, which she respected. That depends on what you want, he said finally. I want the estate in my name. I want my brother found and returned safely. I want my stepmother and Edmund held accountable for what they've done, publicly, on record. Not quietly resolved in a back chamber where they surrender a minor fine and retire to the country. She kept her voice level. I want the people in my territory who relied on my father's name to have a functioning administration instead of one that has been hollowing the accounts for 4 years. And I want to be present for all of it, not informed of the outcome afterward. He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes. Just that. She searched his face for qualification, for the small retreat that usually followed a man agreeing to something that later turned out to mean considerably less than stated. She found nothing that looked like retreat. Why? She asked. You could handle all of this without my participation. It would be simpler. Simpler is not always better governed, he said. And you have standing. This is your estate, your family, your name. Decisions made without you are less legitimate, not more. He paused. Also, I don't find your participation inconvenient. You think clearly. That's not as common as it should be in rooms where decisions are being made. Ella was not accustomed to being told she thought clearly. She had been told, in various ways and by various people throughout her life, that she was perceptive to the point of being uncomfortable, that she noticed things she wasn't meant to notice, that her tendency to state plain facts in plain language was a form of social failure, that an Alpha King was describing the same quality as an asset arranged something in her chest that she chose, for now, not to examine. The Vern family, she said. If they paid to bury my father's petition, are they involved in this as well? I don't know yet. It's possible your stepmother acted independently, and the Vern connection is older, separate. He stood, which was not a dismissal, but the movement of someone shifting from one phase of a conversation to the next. We move toward Dawn Ridge at first light. You'll ride with my party. Sorsha needs to monitor you for the next several days, and I need access to the petition records. You're not going to ask me whether I want to go to Dawn Ridge. You told me you wanted to be present for all of it. A very brief, entirely unsentimental pause. Dawn Ridge is where the work is. She stood as well. They were perhaps 4 feet apart, and in the firelight, she was aware again of the particular quality of his attention. That steadiness, that absence of performance. He was not trying to make her feel safe. He was simply being someone in whose presence safety was structurally more likely. And there was a difference between those two things that she felt down to the bone. I'll need different clothes, she said. What I'm wearing will mark me as Ashvale before I've had a chance to establish anything. Sorcha will see to it. And I'll need to write something down tonight. Everything I heard in that kitchen, every detail before it starts to blur at the edges. She met his eyes. Do you have paper? He crossed to the pack near the door and produced a folded notebook and a stick of charcoal without comment, and held them out to her. She took them. Their fingers did not touch, quite. She sat back down near the fire and opened the notebook to the first page and began to write down everything she remembered. Every word, every pause, every inflection that told her something about timing and intent. She wrote until the fire had burned down by half, and the way station had gone fully quiet around her. Dominic did not leave the room. He sat near the door with his back against the wall and said nothing. And she found, to her own slight surprise, that his presence did not make the writing harder. It made it easier. She did not allow herself to think about why. Dawnridge rose out of the morning fog like something that had decided to exist through sheer insistence. Ella had expected a court. What she found was something closer to a working city contained within fortress walls. Stone buildings stacked up the hillside in deliberate tiers, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the smell of horses and iron and bread baking somewhere behind the main gate. The wolves who moved through the courtyard as Dominic's party rode in did not stop to stare, which she noted. A court that stared at new arrivals was a court of gossip and hierarchy anxiety. This one kept moving, which suggested either supreme indifference or supreme confidence, and she suspected it was the latter. She had ridden the past 2 days in a state of careful observation, cataloging everything about Dominic's operation, the way she had always cataloged things, quietly, without appearing to. His riders obeyed him without the nervous overcorrection she associated with men who ruled through fear. They anticipated his preferences without being sycophantic about it. When he made a decision, he stated it once, clearly, and did not revisit it unless new information warranted revision, which she had seen happen twice on the road, and both times he had adjusted without visible ego cost. She had ridden beside Sorsha mostly, learning what she could. How long has he held the Dawnridge territory? She had asked, on the second afternoon. Born to it, Sorsha said, though held it alone since 26. His father died during the Eastern Border conflict. She paused. He rebuilt the court from poor ground. The previous council had been managed, shall we say, by certain family interests. He dissolved it in his first year. 3 members tried to have him removed by petition. He let the petition proceed through proper channels, won it on the merits, and then offered 2 of the 3 members' positions in the new administration. Sorsha glanced sideways at her. The 3rd one he had investigated for financial fraud. That investigation is still ongoing 4 years later. He is patient when patience produces better outcomes. Ella had thought about that. Now, inside the walls of Dawnridge, she was taken by Sorsha to a set of rooms on the 3rd tier. Clean, plain, well appointed in the manner of a space that had been prepared by someone who thought about function before decoration. A fire already burning. A wardrobe containing clothes in neutral colors that fit her tolerably well, which suggested someone had estimated her measurements with reasonable accuracy. A desk with paper, ink, and a proper pen. She stood in the center of the room and breathed. Then she sat at the desk and continued writing. The formal session with Dominic and his 2 senior advisors came on the 3rd morning. By then, Ella had produced 12 pages of detailed notes. The conversation in the kitchen, reconstructed as precisely as she could manage. A chronology of events going back 8 months, including specific dates when the tincture had changed and when Cale had last written to her. A list of every person in the Ashvale household who might have information and an assessment of their likely loyalty, and a brief analysis of the estate accounts as she understood them, including 3 discrepancies she had noticed over the past 2 years and dismissed as her own misunderstanding. She had not dismissed them. She had been correct, and she had talked herself out of her own correct perception, which was something she intended never to do again. The advisors were named Petra and Wren, a woman and a man, both older than Dominic, both carrying the particular alertness of people who spent their working lives processing complex information quickly. They read her notes in silence. Petra made marginal annotations in small, precise handwriting. Wren asked 3 clarifying questions, all of them good ones. Dominic sat at the end of the table and read without annotating, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he processed. Complete intake first, response after. "The Vern connection," Petra said finally, setting down the last page. "You mentioned your stepmother had existing relationships in the eastern districts. Would the Vern estate fall within that network?" "I don't know for certain," Ella said. "But when I was 14, she attended a gathering at the Vern estate and was gone for 9 days. At the time I thought nothing of it. Now I think it's possible the arrangement goes back further than I knew." "We've been pulling the Vern records since you arrived," Wren said. "There's a financial transfer 8 years ago from an unnamed account to a Vern intermediary. The amount matches what a petition burial would have cost." He looked at Ella. "Your father's petition was not simply inconvenient to the Vern family. It would have resolved a border dispute that has allowed them to harvest timber from contested land for 11 years. The value of that timber over the period is considerably more than the estate itself," Ella said. "Yes." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "So my stepmother has been working with the Vern family since before my father died, possibly before he became ill." She kept her voice steady. "Is it possible they contributed to his illness?" A silence. "It's possible," Dominic said. He had been watching her throughout the session, as he always watched. That calibrated attention, missing nothing. "We don't yet have evidence of that specific act, but the pattern is consistent with it, and I want you to be prepared for the investigation to go in that direction." She nodded once. She did not trust herself to say anything else about her father yet. "Cale," she said instead, "what have your people found?" "He's alive," Dominic said, and the relief that moved through her was so sudden and so large that she had to press her hands harder against the table to keep it from showing in her face. "He was taken by 2 of Edmund's men 12 days ago. He's being held at a private property in the Viren Outer Territory. A hunting lodge, no official status, not registered with any district ledger. They'll move him if they realize I'm alive and here. They will, Dominic agreed. Which is why the retrieval is already in motion. My people left yesterday morning. He paused. I didn't tell you until I was confident in the information. I didn't want to give you certainty, and then revise it. She looked at him. He had sent people to retrieve her brother before the session, before she had asked, before she had pressed for it. He had acted because it was the next necessary thing, and then he had waited for reliable confirmation before telling her, because false hope was cruelty dressed as kindness. She understood him, she realized, in the specific way one understands someone whose logic runs along similar lines as one's own. When will they be back? She asked. 4 days, perhaps 5. Then we use the 4 days to build the evidentiary record. She looked at Petra. What do you need from me to formalize the petition fraud case? Your signed attestation of the kitchen conversation, your chronology, and a formal statement of the inheritance timeline under Ashvale succession law. Petra paused. And I'd like to review the 3 account discrepancies you noted. If we can demonstrate financial mismanagement in parallel with the poison case, the council review becomes considerably more straightforward. You'll have it by tomorrow. Petra gave her a brief, approving look. Wren made a note. Dominic said nothing, but she was aware of his gaze. The 4 days were the kind of work she hadn't known she was capable of. Not because she lacked intelligence, but because no one had previously given her the architecture for it. At Ashvale, she had been managed, guided away from the accounts, kept comfortable and peripheral. Here she sat with Petra for hours and built arguments the way one builds a case, one piece of evidence establishing the next, the whole structure growing more solid with each addition. She found she was good at it. Better than good. She had a particular ability to see where the gaps were, where a claim needed one more piece of support, where an argument was technically sound, but emotionally unpersuasive to a council that would be looking for reasons to do less rather than more. She slept fitfully. She woke twice from dreams of the kitchen door, her husband's voice saying the transfer must be completed, the sound of it so clean and domestic against the content of the words. On the second night, she was sitting at the desk at an hour that was closer to dawn than midnight, when she heard a knock at the door, brief, not urgent. She opened it. Dominic. He was not in the formal riding coat. A simpler dark shirt, sleeves pushed to the elbow, which somehow made him look more solid rather than less. He carried 2 cups. I saw the light under the door, he said. I couldn't sleep. He offered one of the cups without pressing, and she took it. Plain tea, hot, nothing medicinal. She stepped back from the door, and he came in and stood near the window rather than sitting, which preserved the space between them in a way she noticed and appreciated. You don't have to build the entire case tonight, he said. I know. She wrapped her hands around the cup. I keep thinking about what my stepmother told him. The healer has already adjusted the tincture, past tense. She didn't say she was going to do it. She said she had already done it. She paused. She was thorough. She had layers to it. Edmund was one layer, the healer was another, the Vern family underneath. She planned this across years. She looked out the window at the dark courtyard. I wonder how long she looked at me and saw only an obstacle. Some people, Dominic said, look at everything and see only what it costs or pays them. It's not a reflection of what you are. I know that. She glanced at him. I'm not mourning that she didn't love me. I made my peace with that a long time ago. I'm just making sure I understand the architecture of it, so I don't miss anything. He was quiet for a moment. Your father, he said. Did he know what she was? I don't think so. She was certain of this in the way she was certain of few things. He was intelligent, but he was not suspicious by nature. He believed in people's stated intentions. It was one of the things that made him good at governance and vulnerable to her. She set the cup down. I have more of his suspicion. I just didn't apply it soon enough. You were inside it, Dominic said. It's harder to see from inside. She looked at him. The steadiness of him in the lamplight. The complete absence of the reassuring half-truths people usually deployed when someone was being hard on themselves. He was not telling her she had done her best. He was not absolving her. He was offering a fact the way he offered all facts, without decoration. You knew I was an Omega before I told you, she said. On the road. Yes. Did it change how you assess the situation? He considered the question genuinely, which was itself an answer of a kind. It changed what I expected the situation to be, he said. A lone Omega on a northern road before dawn, shaking, carrying nothing. I expected someone running from a bad bonding, which is common enough. I did not expect someone with a 12-page evidence document and a working theory about multi-generational land fraud. You didn't treat me like you expected the first thing. No, he held her gaze, because within 30 seconds it was clear the first thing was wrong. She thought about Edmund, who had looked at her with eyes that never revised their initial assessment. Who had decided what she was before speaking to her, and never bothered to update the picture. The contrast was not lost on her. She was not ready to say anything about it, but she felt it, the way one feels a change in air pressure, a shift in the atmosphere that didn't announce itself, but changed what was possible. I need you to do something, she said. Tell me. When we present to the council, I want to speak. Not as a witness, as the Ashvale claimant. I want to present the case. A pause. There will be council members who object to that structure, he said. I know. That's why I'm asking you to allow it regardless. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression was not quite a smile, more the quality of recognition, as though she had done the thing he had expected her to do, and he found it accurate rather than surprising. Yes, he said. The same word as before, with the same absence of qualification. She turned back to the window. Outside, the courtyard was still, and the sky at the eastern edge was beginning to move from black to the particular dark blue that came before color returned to things. 4 days. She had 4 days before Cale came home, and after that the walls would start to close on her stepmother and Edmund and the Verna family, and she needed to be ready. She needed to be more than ready. She needed to be the person standing in that council room who could not be argued past, or managed sideways, or dismissed as an Omega with a grievance. She thought she could be that person. She thought, for the first time in a very long time, that the version of herself she had been suppressing in the interest of keeping the peace at Ashvale was not a problem to be solved. It was the only version of her that was going to survive this. Cale came back on the 5th day, which was 1 day later than expected, and felt like a year. Ella was in the courtyard when the riders came through the gate. 4 of Dominic's wolves and a 5th horse carrying her brother, thinner than she remembered, a bruise along his left cheekbone that had gone to yellow at the edges, meaning it was healing. She crossed the courtyard before she had decided to move. He dismounted before she reached him, and they collided somewhere in the middle, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and held on with both hands and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate, and the silence was more honest. He held her with the same grip, tight, slightly desperate, the embrace of someone who had spent several days unsure whether they were being held as a warning or a permanent arrangement. You're alive, he said against her hair. I'm alive, she confirmed, and you're at Dawnridge Court. He pulled back to look at her face. His eyes moved quickly, her color, her hands, her posture, the same inventory she had been running on him. How? I walked north, she said, and then I was very fortunate about who I met on the road. He looked past her. She knew without turning that Dominic had come into the courtyard. The Alpha King, Cale said, not quite a question. Yes. Her brother studied her face for a moment with the particular attention of someone who had known her for 24 years, and could read the spaces between what she said. He did not say anything about what he found there. He simply nodded, slowly, and then looked at Dominic with the direct assessment of a younger brother deciding whether someone had treated his sister correctly. Whatever he saw appeared to satisfy him. The council session was held 6 days later. Petra had argued for 2 weeks of preparation. Ella had said 10 days was sufficient and had been right. By day 8, the evidentiary record was complete, cross-referenced, and structured with a clarity that Wren had called, in a tone of mild professional envy, unusually airtight. The chamber was long and stone-walled, lit by high windows that let in a cold autumn light without warmth. 12 council members seated at the curved table, all of them wolves, all of them senior, several of them visibly uncertain about the structure of the session. Ella stood at the presenting position and felt the uncertainty directed at her like a mild weather system. Not violent, just present. Her stepmother, Maren, sat at the far end of the room with Edmund beside her, both summoned under the formal authority of the court. They had arrived the previous evening under escort, and Ella had not seen them yet. She looked at Maren now and registered the expression on her face, controlled, prepared, the face of a woman who had already constructed her counter-narrative and was waiting for an opportunity to deploy it. Ella did not give her one. She presented for 40 minutes. She moved through the evidence in the sequence she and Petra had designed. The petition fraud first, because it was the oldest and most documented piece, and it established the pattern. Then the estate account discrepancies, which gave the financial motive concrete form. Then the healer's adjusted tincture, for which Sorsha provided written medical attestation confirming the ashenweed compound. Then the kitchen conversation. Her signed attestation, every word as she had heard it. Then Cale's detention, confirmed by testimony from Dominic's own writers. She kept her voice level throughout. Not flat. Level. There is a difference. Flat suggests nothing is at stake. Level suggests everything is at stake, and she has chosen not to let it capsize her delivery. When she finished, one of the older council members, a gray-bearded wolf named Aldrich, who had been visibly skeptical at the start, looked at her for a long moment and said, "You prepared this yourself." "With support from Petra and Wren," she said. "The structure is mine." He made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, but she catalogued it as a point moved. Maren's advocate spoke for 20 minutes. The argument was competent. She had found a good one, and rested primarily on the claim that the kitchen conversation was unverifiable. The account discrepancies were the result of legitimate administrative decisions made under difficult circumstances following her husband's death, and that the ashenweed compound could have entered the tincture through contaminated sourcing rather than deliberate action. It was a reasonable defense constructed around the deliberate absence of documentation. It was also constructed without knowledge of the Vern financial transfer. Wren presented that piece himself, briefly and with precision. The 8-year-old payment, the intermediary account, the correlation with the petition burial date. He said nothing inflammatory. He simply put it on the record. The room changed. Ella watched Maren's face in the moment the Vern information was presented and saw, beneath the controlled surface, the specific quality of calculation that comes when someone realizes the ground has shifted further than they accounted for. She had not known the Vern connection was documented. She had believed, apparently, that she was the only person who had ever looked. The council deliberated for 3 hours. The outcome was not a surprise, but it was thorough, which was what mattered. Maren was stripped of all administrative authority over Ashvale Estate, effective immediately, and held pending a full criminal investigation into the poisoning, the illegal detention of a blood heir, and her potential role in the death of Ella's father. That last item added by Aldrich, who had apparently decided during deliberation that the pattern warranted it. Edmund's bonding contract was dissolved on grounds of fraud and conspiracy, which under the territory's succession law also invalidated any claim his family had derived from it. The Verna estate was placed under formal audit, their timber operations in the contested land suspended pending resolution of the original border dispute. The same dispute Ella's father had tried to resolve 11 years ago, and been prevented from resolving by a paid burial. The Ashvale deed was transferred to Ella, in her name, unconditionally, and on record. She stood in the stone corridor after the session, with the formal document in her hands, and Cale beside her reading over her shoulder, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Papa would have been excessively pleased about the Verna audit, Cale said finally. He would have been unbearable about it, Ella agreed. They stood in the corridor and allowed themselves that for a moment, the uncomplicated satisfaction of a thing finally corrected, even too late for the person it should have protected most. The evening after the council session, Ella found Dominic in the library. He was reading, which she had learned was what he did when the day's work was finished, and the administrative requirements had released him. Not a performance of leisure, but an actual retreat into it. The quiet of a man who genuinely found books more interesting than most conversations. She had come to understand, over the past 10 days, that his containment was not coldness. It was preference. A preference for substance over performance, for precision over volume, for doing things correctly over being seen doing them. She stood in the doorway until he looked up. "The estate documents came through," she said. "I know." He set the book down. "How do you feel?" She considered the question honestly, which was the only kind of answer he had ever seemed to want from her. "Strange," she said. "Lighter than I expected and not as relieved as I expected. There's still the investigation. There's still months of work to make Ashvale functional again." She paused. "I keep waiting for the part where something else goes wrong." "That's reasonable," he said. "After what you've been through, expecting the floor to hold takes time." She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him, because they had fallen into this without deciding to. Evening conversations in rooms where the firelight was good, and he listened the way he did everything, completely, without rushing toward the next thing. She had told him about her father in small pieces over the past week, and he had received each piece as though it mattered, which was more than most people had managed. "I need to return to Ashvale," she said. "Not immediately, but soon. There's a winter to prepare for, staff who have been working under Marin's administration who will need clarity. And Cale wants to come back with me. Help rebuild the pack presence." She paused. "He's already talking about sending notices to the wolves who scattered after Father died." "Good," Dominic said simply. She looked at him. The fire behind him. The book closed on the arm of the chair. The particular quality of his stillness, that she had come to read not as distance, but as the structural equivalent of deep water, still on the surface because there was a great deal of depth beneath. She thought about the northern road, the cold before dawn, and a rider who had stopped and gotten down from his horse because she looked like someone who needed the conversation to happen at eye level. She thought about the cup of plain hot water left on the bench beside her seat, the paper and charcoal produced without ceremony, the 4 days of preparation he had given her, the council session in which he had sat at the end of the table and not spoken unless asked. Entirely present, entirely ready, entirely committed to letting her be the one who spoke. She thought about the mate bond. She had felt it. In the way one feels something one is not ready to name. A particular quality of attention when he entered a room. A sense of rightness in the spaces between their conversations. The way her body had begun to understand his presence as safe before her mind had caught up. She knew he felt it too. She had seen it in the way he looked at her. Not with the clumsy urgency of a man who had decided something, but with the patient certainty of someone waiting for the moment she was ready. He had never said it. He had never used it as leverage. He had never allowed it to color his treatment of her case, his respect for her work, his willingness to let her be the one who led. "I know what you haven't said," she told him. He held her gaze. "I know you do." I'm not afraid of it," she said. "I was. For a while I thought the word itself was contaminated by everything that had been built around it. bonds and promises and ceremonies that turned out to be architecture for something else entirely. She paused. But that was the word in their mouths. It doesn't have to mean what they made it mean. No, he said. It doesn't. She looked at the fire for a moment. Outside the library window, the Dawnridge courtyard was quiet and dark, and the first frost of the season had laid itself across the stones like a clean beginning. "Come to Ashvale," she said, "when it's ready. When we've had time to rebuild it into something that looks like what it was supposed to be." She looked back at him. "Come because you want to see what it becomes. Come because I'm asking, not because of what we are to each other by nature, because of what we've chosen to be by action." She held his gaze. "That distinction matters to me." "I know," he said. "It's one of the things I find most worth honoring about you." He did not move toward her. He did not reach for her. He simply held her gaze with that complete, unhurried attention, and she understood that he would wait as long as she needed. Not from indifference, but from the kind of respect that knows the difference between readiness and patience. She stood. She crossed the room to his chair. She put her hand against his jaw, the scarred side, and felt him go very still beneath her touch, in the way that something powerful goes still when it chooses stillness, rather than needing it. She kissed him quietly, without performance, the way one does a thing one has decided on with full knowledge. When she stepped back, his hand had come up to cover hers against his face, and he kept it there a moment before letting go. "Ashvale in spring," he said. "Ashvale in spring," she agreed. She left Dawnridge on a clear morning 2 weeks later, with Cale beside her and a court escort that Dominic had insisted on, and she had accepted without argument, because some things were practical rather than sentimental. The road south was the same road she had walked north on in the dark and the cold, and it looked entirely different in daylight. Wider, more manageable, the trees on either side carrying the last of their autumn color. Cale rode quietly beside her for a mile before he said anything. "He's coming in spring," he said. "He is." "You're not going to tell me anything else?" "Not right now." He considered this and appeared to find it acceptable. "Papa would have liked him," he said finally. "He would have spent the first week finding reasons to be difficult about it, and then he would have liked him enormously." "Yes," she said. "He would have." The road stretched ahead of them, south toward Ashvale, toward the estate with her father's seal and her mother's garden, and the empty rooms that needed new life moved into them, toward staff who needed stability, toward accounts that needed correcting, toward a pack that needed rebuilding, toward a name that had been nearly taken, and was now simply hers. She rode toward all of it without hurry, and without fear. The winter sun flat and clean on the frost-white fields, Cale's voice picking up a mild argument about the most efficient route through the outer district, and somewhere to the north, a man who had made a promise in the simplest possible way, by simply meaning it, waiting for spring. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.